Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. May all the peace and blessings of the Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be on all of us. Today, as you can see, I want us to dive and navigate through the process of absorption of water from the soil. And as you can see, as you know that the process of water absorption from the soil is an easy equation that has been tested in many KCSE years. Now, as you can see, let's look at the structure first, then we can discuss how water moves from the soil into the root, to the stem, finally to the leaf, then to the atmosphere, and how the process is being repeated. Now you can see that we have film of water, we have soil particles, we have the root hair cell, we have the piliferous layer, we have the cortex, we have the endodermis, we have the pericycle, and finally we have the xylem of the root. Now let's start our process without wasting time. What we say is that water exists as a thin film in between the soil particles. And therefore, the concentration of the root hair cell is higher as compared to the water particles in the soil. And as such, therefore, water will be absorbed through the process of osmosis from the soil into the root hair cell. What follows next? As more water is drawn into the root hair cells gets diluted or becomes hypotonic as compared to the adjacent cortex cells. And therefore, through the process of osmosis again, water will move from the root hair cell into the adjacent cortex cell. And the cortex cell will draw more water, and therefore they will also get diluted, and that now successively happens through the endodermis pericycle until water gets finally into the xylem of the root. Now, once water gets into the xylem of the root, what follows next? Water is again conducted into the xylem of the stem. From the xylem of the stem, water is again conducted into the xylem of the leaf. From here now, water now moves out of the leaf through the spongy mesophyll cells into the intercellular air spaces. And once water moves from the spongy mesophyll cells into the intercellular air spaces, the spongy mesophyll cells becomes concentrated. And once they become concentrated, they start drawing water from the adjacent cells to the spongy mesophyll cells. And that is the palisade cells, the epidermis, and finally the xylem of the leaf. Now, the xylem of the leaf now will also draw water from the xylem of the stem. And the xylem of the stem will draw water from the xylem of the root. Now the xylem of the root, which will draw water from now the pericycle, endodermis, cortex, the root hair cell, and finally the soil. And class, there are various forces involved in the process of water absorption from the soil. Namely, and that is, number one, we have a force called the cohesion and adhesion force. Cohesion is the process where water molecules get attached, or rather molecules of the same kind get attached to one another and follows as a continuous column. We also have an adhesive force, and that is the linkage, or rather the kind of the molecules and the walls of the xylem. The attachment of the water molecules and the xylem vessels of the roots, stem, and finally the leaf now brings us the adhesive forces. Now let's go to another force called the capillarity. Capillarity again is the force, or rather the tendency, in which water molecules rises in a narrow tube. And as you can see that the xylem basically displays the structure of a tube. Another force we have is the transpiration pull. And the transpiration pull basically is that suction force that draws a stream of water from the xylem of the stem and the xylem of the roots and takes them to the leaf finally, from the leaf to the atmosphere, and the cycle starts repeating as a result of the higher concentration of the spongy mesophyll cells, which will in turn draw water from the adjacent cells, which will draw from the xylem of the leaf, from the xylem of the stem, xylem of the roots, and that is a suction force that tries to draw water along from the roots, stem, and finally the leaf. We also have the root pressure. That is the active pumping of water molecules across the endodermis into the xylem vessels. And basically, class, if you are asked about an essay question requiring a description of the process of water absorption from the soil, you basically tell us the higher concentration of water molecules in the soil particles and as compared to the cell sap of the root hair cell. And therefore, when the cell sap of the root hair cell is highly concentrated, that means through the process of osmosis, water molecules will be absorbed from the soil into the root hair cells. And from the root hair cells, as more water is drawn into the root hair cells class, the root hair cells gets diluted. And once it gets diluted, it becomes hypotonic to the adjacent cortex cells, where now water will be drawn from the root hair cells into the adjacent cortex cells. And therefore, class, this process is continuously and successively repeated along until water finally reaches the xylem of the root. And once water reaches the xylem of the root, the water is again conducted through to the xylem of the stem and finally to the xylem of the leaf. And once water reaches into the intercellular spaces as a result of water moving out of the spongy mesophyll cells into the intercellular spaces and finally getting out through the stomata into the atmosphere. Therefore, the intercellular and the spongy mesophyll cells get highly concentrated and start drawing water from the adjacent cells, which will in turn draw from the other adjacent cells and finally from the xylem of the leaf, xylem of the stem, and finally the xylem of the roots. And we also describe about the 4 forces involved in water conduction. That is the cohesion and adhesion forces, the transpiration pull, the root pressure, and finally the capillarity. And that is briefly about the process of water absorption from the soil. Wish you all the best and have a prosperous day ahead. Thank you very much.